Sheriff Lena Harpe had seen her fair share of chaos in the small town of Brookfield, Texas. But tonight, after a grueling shift, she was looking forward to something rare: peace. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the streets, and as Lena drove through the quiet town, the weight of the day seemed to melt away. She had earned this moment of calm. At just 34, Lena was the youngest sheriff Brookfield had ever seen, and the first woman to hold the position. It hadn't been easy. The town, steeped in tradition, hadn't always welcomed the idea of a female sheriff. Whispers still lingered, but Lena had proven time and time again that she was more than capable. She was determined, sharp, and respected. Tonight, though, none of that mattered. Tonight was about her and Sam, her husband, the one person who had always been her rock, the one person who had been there through every late-night shift and difficult case. As she pulled into the driveway of their modest home, a sense of relief washed over her. The door was a few steps away, and with it, a quiet evening, a warm meal, and the comfort of the man she loved. But things in Brookfield had a way of never staying calm for long. Before we dive deeper into Lena's story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will change everything. Trust me, you don't want to miss the twist ahead. Lena pulled into the driveway, the weight of the day lifting slightly as she saw her house come into view. The evening was just starting to settle in, the world around her quieting down. It had been a long, exhausting shift, and all she wanted was to walk through the door, take off her boots, and sink into the normalcy of her home. Sam, her husband, was waiting for her, and that thought alone was a comfort as she stepped out of the car. Lena noticed Mrs. Diane, her neighbor across the street, standing in her front yard, watering her plants. At first, Lena didn't think much of it. Nothing out of the ordinary for a small town like Brookfield. But as she drew closer, she caught something in Mrs. Diane's demeanor that made her pause. The older woman, usually so friendly and approachable, was acting strange. Mrs. Diane's movements were jerky, hurried, and her eyes darted nervously when they met Lena's. It was enough to make Lena stop in her tracks. "Good evening, Mrs. Diane," Lena called out, offering a smile despite her weariness. "Oh, evening, Sheriff," Mrs. Diane responded, her voice higher than usual, almost startled. She quickly lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around the handle of the watering can as if she wanted to be anywhere but standing there. Lena didn't immediately react. Mrs. Diane had always been a bit odd, but this was different. Lena's cop instincts kicked in, the ones that kept her sharp for years. But she brushed it off. Maybe it was nothing. After all, small towns had a way of making everyone nervous, especially when Sheriff was nearby. Still, something didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way Mrs. Diane wouldn't meet her eyes, or how quickly she turned her back, rushing inside as if she couldn't get away fast enough. Lena shook her head. There would be time to figure out later. But for now, she had one thing on her mind: a quiet evening with Sam. She made her way to the door, her thoughts still lingering on the strange interaction. Would it come to anything? Probably not. But tonight, she was ready to relax, let the world outside fade for a few hours. Little did she know, things in Brookfield were about to shift in ways she could never have anticipated. Make sure to stay with us as we move forward, because things are about to get much more complicated. Lena reached for the door, her fingers brushing the handle, but then something stopped her. A sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but as she stood there, it grew clearer. The soft creaking of wood. A muffled noise like a groan. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Her mind raced, trying to place the sound. It was all too familiar. The moans, the creaks, it was unmistakable. It wasn't the normal hum of the house settling or the sound of the wind outside. No, this was something different. Something she couldn't ignore. Lena stood still for a moment, trying to make sense of it, but her thoughts quickly shifted to something else. A conversation she had overheard earlier that day at the local diner. A quiet, almost casual remark about Sam. The kind of gossip that would have been easy to dismiss if it hadn't been for the strange tension in the air, the way the words had stuck in her mind long after they were said. Was it possible? Could there be any truth to those rumors? She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, standing at the threshold of her home, the weight of it all felt different. The noise inside, the sudden doubt that crept into her mind. It all started to make sense in a way that made her stomach churn to Lena's instincts, honed over years of law enforcement, kicked in. She didn't know what was waiting for her on the other side of that door, but she knew it wasn't good. Every fiber of her being told her to brace herself for something she wasn't ready to face. Her hand tightened on the doorknob, her pulse quickening. She wasn't sure what she was about to walk into, but one thing was clear. Whatever it was going to change everything. Stay with us, because what Lena finds behind that door will leave you stunned. Keep watching. This story is about to take a dangerous turn. Lena pushed the door open, stepping into familiar comfort of her home, but the sense of peace she'd been craving vanished the moment she crossed the threshold. The muffled sounds were now louder, clearer. There was no mistaking what she was hearing. The creaks, the soft gasps, the undeniable rhythm of two bodies tangled in something far from innocent. It was coming from upstairs, from the master bedroom. Her heart began to race, a cold sweat prickling her skin. She moved toward the stairs, her feet heavy, each step feeling like it took her further away from the life she thought she knew. The noise grew more distinct with every step. Moans, shuffling, the unmistakable sound of betrayal. Each sound echoed louder, almost as if mocking her. Lena reached the top of the stairs and hesitated. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes caught sight of the bedroom door, slightly ajar. She didn't want to see what was on the other side, but her legs moved of their own accord, carrying her closer, each step bringing her face to face with a truth she wasn't prepared for. She pushed the door open, and what she saw made her heart stop. There in her own bed was Sam, her husband, the man she had trusted with every piece of herself. And tangled up with him, just inches away, was Linda, her mother, the very woman who had raised her, taught her right from wrong, the woman she had always turned to for advice. The world tilted beneath Lena's feet. Time seemed to freeze, the noise of the room dimming into nothing. Her eyes locked onto the scene before her, but her brain refused to process it. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. How could it? The betrayal cut deeper than anything she had ever imagined. It wasn't just the shock of seeing her husband with another woman. It was her, the one person she had trusted most in the world, the one who had always been her anchor. And now she was in bed with Sam, her own flesh and blood. The two people she loved the most, the ones who had always been a part of her foundation, were now the ones who had shattered everything. Lena couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred as the reality set in, and in that moment, everything she had built, her marriage, her trust, her life fell apart in front of her. The pain of it was overwhelming, suffocating. She stood there frozen, unable to move, caught in the harsh grip of her shattered world. What happens next will change everything. Stay with us, because the storm that follows this discovery is only beginning. The moment Linda caught sight of Lena standing in the doorway, her face went pale. She gasped, her eyes widening in shock, and that sound, the sharp, fearful intake of breath, was enough to snap Sam out of his stupor. He looked up at Lena, his expression faltering as he saw the devastation in her eyes. His lips parted, as if searching for words, but there was nothing that could make sense of this moment. No explanation that could undo what had just happened. "Lena, wait," Sam began, his voice trembling, but was too late. The disbelief turned to rage, a wave of emotion that Lena couldn't hold back. Her body was on fire with it. Fury, betrayal, pain, all colliding together. Her breath came in short bursts, her chest heaving with the weight of it. "How dare you?" she shouted, her voice raw and breaking. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. She took a step forward, her hands trembling, but there was no stopping the flood of anger that surged through her. She wasn't thinking. She couldn't think. It was as if every ounce of her control had evaporated. In a blur of emotion, Lena lashed out. Without even realizing it, her teeth sank into Linda's lip. Linda screamed, the sound piercing the room. But Lena didn't stop. It was as though she couldn't feel the pain, couldn't register the consequences. All she could hear was the sound of betrayal, echoing louder than anything else. Sam scrambled to get away, his body reacting instinctively. He tried to move, to flee the scene, but Lena's rage didn't let him. She turned on him in an instant, the adrenaline fueling her every move. With a speed born of sheer anger, she grabbed hold of Sam, her hands closing around with a force he hadn't expected. She wasn't thinking about the man who had been her partner, her rock. She only wanted him to feel what she was feeling. She wanted him to understand the agony he had just caused. Sam struggled, his face contorting with pain, but Lena's grip tightened. The physical force of it was enough to make him crumble. He gasped for air, the shock of her strength overtaking him. But it wasn't enough to stop her. Her mind clouded, all logic gone. Lena struck again, sending Sam crashing to the floor, his body limp from the weight of her fury. The room felt like it was closing in on her. She stood over him, chest heaving, blood dripping from her mouth. But even in that moment, the storm inside her wasn't over. The room was a blur of chaos, emotions too raw to contain. The scene was a nightmare. Two people she had once trusted, destroyed before her eyes, and her own hands were stained with the violence of her rage. It was as if she had lost herself in the act, no longer the calm sheriff, no longer the wife or the daughter, just a woman consumed by betrayal. What happens next will shake the foundation of everything Lena knows. Stay tuned, because the truth will come out, but nothing will ever be the same again. Lena stood frozen, her chest heaving with each breath, as she looked down at Sam, her husband, lying on the floor in front of her. He was unconscious, his body limp, blood staining his shirt and the hardwood floor beneath him. The scene around her felt surreal, as if she was watching everything unfold from a distance. The room was chaos. Furniture overturned, the bed in disarray, and the air thick with a metallic scent of blood. Her mind couldn't fully process what just happened, but the destruction in front of her was undeniable. Her hands were shaking as they hovered in the air, unsure whether to reach for Sam or step back. But there was no going back now. The moment she had walked in on him and Linda, everything had shattered. The woman she loved, the man she had trusted, both of them were now lost to her, permanently. It didn't matter how she had gotten here, or how much regret she felt in this moment. The damage was done, and there was no way to undo it. The wail of sirens cut through the thick silence, their high-pitched sound drawing closer, and Lena's heart skipped a beat. The neighbors had definitely heard the commotion. She had been so consumed by the violence of her own actions, so focused on the pain she had felt, that she hadn't realized the noise it carried. They would be here soon. The law would be here soon. And she was the one who had caused all of this. That Lena's stomach twisted with the knowledge that there was no escaping the consequences now. There was no more hiding behind the badge, no more pretending that everything was still the same. As the wailing sirens grew louder, she turned her gaze to the doorway. The first officer stepped into the room, Deputy Chief Thomas Miller, someone she had worked with for years. His face was a mixture of disbelief and concern, but it didn't take long for his professional demeanor to take over. "Lena," he said softly, his voice shaking slightly, his gaze flicking to Sam, then to her. "What happened?" Lena's eyes locked onto his, but she couldn't speak. She couldn't explain. What was there to say? She had lost control. She had let rage and betrayal guide her, and now there was nothing left but the mess she had made. The other officers filtered into the room, their expressions tense, their eyes scanning the destruction, their training kicking in. Lena, the sheriff, the woman they had once respected, now stood in the middle of the wreckage, her life completely shattered. As one of the officers moved to restrain her, her body went limp, the weight of what had happened settling in. She was no longer the sheriff in control of Brookfield. She was just another criminal, her career and her future slipping through her fingers with every second that passed. "Lena, you're under arrest," one of the officers said, his voice firm, but there was a hesitation there, like he didn't quite believe what he was saying. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, and for the first time in years, Lena felt small, helpless. The sound of her own arrest echoed in her mind, drowning out everything else. The storm of emotion she had been holding in for so long had exploded, and now it was over. Her life, her career, her marriage, everything she had worked for had crumbled to dust in an instant. And as the officers guided her out of the room, leaving behind the chaos of her home, Lena realized that nothing would ever be the same again. Stay with us, because the consequences of Lena's actions are only beginning to unfold. What happens next will change everything in Brookfield, and for Lena, The small town of Brookfield had never seen anything like this. The news spread like wildfire, carried by the whispers of every resident who had heard the sirens at night. It wasn't long before the story of Sheriff Lena Harpe's violent outburst and the betrayal that triggered it dominated every conversation in town. People were talking, and people were divided, a.t. the Brookfield diner. The usual morning hum of chatter was replaced with nervous energy, the clink of silverware falling silent as the topic of the day took center stage. Mabel, the postmistress, leaned forward at her usual seat, her hands shaking as she sipped her coffee. I heard she caught him in the act. She whispered to her companion, Edna, who had been sitting in the same spot for years, and just snapped. Can you imagine? Edna shook her head, clearly disturbed, but unable to look away. I don't know what to think. Lena was always so level-headed. But this is something else. Across the room, Frank Delgado, the hardware store owner, couldn't hide his satisfaction. You know what they say about women in charge. I told everyone a female sheriff would bring trouble. Looks like I was right. His words sent a ripple of disapproval through the diner, but no one spoke up. Everyone was too consumed with their own thoughts. Some whisper that Lena had been pushed too far, that her actions were understandable given the heartbreak. Others, like Frank, couldn't help but gloat, seeing the downfall of the woman who had never quite fit their idea of leadership. The town was torn, opinions sharp as ever, and no one could agree on whether she deserved sympathy or scorn. Over at Brookfield High School, the ripple effect of the scandal was felt just as intensely. Sam's absence was immediate and noticeable. Teachers whispered in the halls. Students exchanged uncertain glances. No one could believe it. Sam, their beloved history teacher, the calm and steady presence in the classroom, was now at the center of a scandal no one saw coming. In the teacher's lounge, Sarah Chun, the biology teacher, muttered as she stirred her coffee. How could he? I've known him for years. He always seemed so dedicated to Lena. How could he betray her like that? James Taylor, the vice principal, sighed deeply. It goes to show you never really know what's happened behind closed doors. He was always so well-liked. But now, this is beyond anything we could have imagined. Meanwhile, across town, the arrival of journalists from Houston turned Brookfield into something it had never been before, a media spectacle. Reporters from the Houston Chronicle TV crews and satellite trucks began filling the quiet streets, setting up in places where people used to stand and chat without a second thought. It didn't take long for Quiet Town to become a circus of flashing cameras, invasive questions, and sensationalized headlines. The small town life that Lena had worked so hard to protect was now under a magnifying glass, and there was no hiding from the spotlight. The stories flooded the news, each one more salacious than the last. Journalists dug deep, seeking out every detail, every angle. The town had become the backdrop for a scandal that would forever change its reputation. No one was safe from the media's reach as Brookfield buzzed with gossip and judgment. Lena was nowhere to be found, but the weight of her fall was being felt by everyone. People were picking sides, and their town would never be the same. Make sure to stay with us. The tension in Brookfield is only growing, and the fallout from Lena's actions is far from over. The town has changed, and the consequences are about to hit harder than anyone expected. Linda sat alone in her living room, the ice pack pressed to her swollen lip, the pain a constant reminder of the chaos she had set in motion. The house was still, too quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavier with every passing minute. Her mind replayed the events over and over, but the reality of what she had done hadn't fully sunk in. Not yet. The affair with Sam had seemed so harmless at first, a secret kept hidden in the shadows, something that made her feel alive again after years of being in her daughter's shadow. It had been a mistake, a terrible choice, but in the beginning it was thrilling, the thrill of being desired again. But now, the thrill had long since worn off, replaced by the crushing weight of guilt and regret. She couldn't escape the fact that it had all been her doing. She had been the one to tear apart the only real relationship she had ever cared about. Lena, her daughter, the one person she had always loved, now hated her. The bond between them was shattered, irreparably broken. And the worst part? She had done it to herself. Linda clenched her jaw, her mind warring between two opposing forces. Anger, guilt, They tore at her. She was angry at Lena, angry for the way her daughter had confronted her, angry for the years of resentment that had built up between them. But there was another feeling there, one that she hated to admit. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing she had hurt Lena, a satisfaction that came from having control, from doing something that had rocked the foundation of their lives. She had taken back something she had long felt was stolen from her. But now, the truth hit hard. The magnitude of what she had done was impossible to ignore. Sam's life was in ruins. He was a shell of the man he had been, unable to escape the consequences of their actions. And the worst part, he wouldn't recover from this. Not after everything that had happened. Linda's heart twisted as she realized the extent of the destruction. She hadn't just destroyed Lena's trust, she had shattered her own life in the process. And no matter how much she tried to tell herself that Lena would understand one day, that they could work through this, deep down she knew it was over. There was no coming back from this. Her relationship with Lena was finished. Sam was gone, and Linda was left with nothing but the wreckage of her own choices. Stay with us. What happens next will reveal just how deep the consequences of Linda's actions run. Nothing will ever be the same again. Lena sat in the cold, dimly lit cell, her hands resting limply on her lap. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on her, and no matter how many times she tried to replay the moments in her mind, they made less sense with each passing second. She had acted out of anger, out of betrayal, and now she was left to face the destruction it had caused. Her marriage was over. Her career was over. Her life, as she had known it, was over. The silence of the holding cell was deafening. The walls, stark and unforgiving, seemed to close in on her as the reality of her situation sank deeper. There was no turning back. The damage had been done, and there was no way to undo it. She had made a choice, and now everything she had built, everything she had worked for, was in ruins. She thought of Sam, lying unconscious, the man she had trusted, the man who had been by her side for years. The betrayal was too much for her to grasp fully, but there was no escaping it. Linda, her mother, the woman who had raised her, shaped her, who should have been her ally, was now a stranger, someone she could never forgive. Lena was forced to confront the one question that had been gnawing at her since that moment she had stepped into the bedroom. Would she ever recover from this? Was there any way to rebuild after everything had been destroyed? Or was this the end of the person she had once been? The first female sheriff in Brookfield, a woman respected by the town, a wife, a daughter? She closed her eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She wasn't sure if there was a way forward, or if there was any hope for redemption. But one thing was clear. Lena had to face whatever came next, whether she was ready or not. The consequences of her actions would follow her, and no amount of wishing would change that. But even as she resolved to face what was to come, a lingering fear took root deep within her. Was this the point of no return? Would she ever be able to find peace again? The life she had known, the woman she had once been, seemed irretrievably lost. It was as though everything she had stood for had been swept away in the tide of her own choices. The fear of permanent destruction stayed with her, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. No matter how much she tried to ignore it, the future remained uncertain, and she knew that the road ahead would be long, painful, and filled with consequences she couldn't yet fully understand. Stay with us. Lena's journey toward redemption or ruin is just beginning. The decision she faces now will determine everything. Lena sat alone in a quiet cell, her mind replaying the events that had unfolded over the past days. How quickly everything had changed. One moment, she had been a respected sheriff of Brookfield, a woman who had worked tirelessly to gain the trust of her community. The next, she was a criminal, her life torn apart by the very people she had trusted most. Sam, the man she had loved, and Linda, the woman who had raised her, were now the sources of the deepest betrayal she had ever known. She had spent years building her reputation, earning the respect of those around her. But in a single moment, in the heat of rage and heartbreak, it had all come crashing down. Her career, her marriage, her future, all of it was gone. The road ahead was uncertain. But the one thing that was clear was that nothing would ever be the same again as she sat in the cold, sterile room. The truth of the situation became undeniable. Betrayal had unraveled everything she had worked for. In the blink of an eye, her entire life had been flipped upside down. And now, in the small town where everyone knew everyone's business, the consequences of her actions would follow her forever. Brookfield had witnessed her rise and fall, and no matter how much time passed, it would never forget. Lena had once been a woman of strength and resolve, but now she was left to confront the wreckage of her own making. And as the days stretched on, she couldn't help but wonder, could she ever rebuild, or had the damage gone too deep? Betrayal had changed everything, and Brookfield had become a place where Lena would no longer be the sheriff, but just another story in the town's dark history. Stay with us, because Lena's journey is far from over. The consequences of this moment will ripple through everything she knew, and the fallout has just begun.